Tom Blanton is the director since 1992 of the independent non-governmental National Security Archive at the George Washington University, which is nsarchive.org. He won the 2004 Emmy Award for Individual Achievement in News and Documentary Research. And on behalf of the archive, he received the George Polk Award in 2000 for, quote, piercing the self-serving veils of government secrecy, unquote. His books have been awarded the 2011 Link Kuehl Prize from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, a selection by Choice Magazine as Outstanding Academic Title 2017, and the American Library Association's James Madison Award citation in 1996, among other honors. The National Freedom of Information Act Hall of Fame elected him as a member in 2006, and Tufts University presented him the Dr. Jean Mayer Global Citizenship Award in 2011 for, quote, decades of demystifying and exposing the underworld of global diplomacy, end quote. His articles have appeared in Diplomatic History, Foreign Policy, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, among many other journals. And he is series co-editor for the National Security Archive's online and book publications of more than 1 million pages of declassified US government documents obtained through the archive's more than 60,000 Freedom of Information Act requests. And that is the topic that he'll be talking about today. Please give a warm MSSR 2021 welcome to Tom Blanton.
Thank you, Jarlath. That was a wonderful, warm introduction. And thank you for all your organizational work to make this symposium happen. And thanks to Anna for just the inspiration and the leadership, because this is a fantastic initiative. And I especially want to point everybody to the resource, The Bridge, which is part of your whole website presentation, because it shows the incredible opportunities there are for archival and documents work in Russia, in the former Soviet Union, despite all the current difficulties. And that really was put together by my wife, Svetlana Savranska. You'll be hearing from her tomorrow on some current issues in US-Russia relations. But also want to say a huge thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for some really visionary philanthropy, but both in support of this initiative and support of the archive. I really mourn the loss of Vartan Grigorian. There was an old phrase when I was growing up playing basketball, be like Mike, meaning Mike Jordan, the greatest ever. And I would say that in today's world and today's challenges with today's US-Russia difficulties, my line would be like Vartan. You know, I'm not saying you have to go back to Tabriz, Iran to start your career all over again, but the languages, the empathy with the other, the determination, the global perspective, and the building of institutions that then diffuse knowledge and make the world a better place. That was Vartan Grigorian. So you've already heard in this symposium from experts and diplomats and veterans of US-Russia relations and scholars of Russia. My role here, as Jarlath said, is to bring the documents to the table, to sort of give the view through the Freedom of Information Act to some of the issues and challenges in US-Russia and some of the history that we need to learn from. So I'll start with just 3 cautions, however, 3 sort of warnings right up front. One warning, the great German historian von Ranke was the first one really in the 1800s to pioneer the application of archives to the study of history. And one of Ranke's rivals commented about him, the dust of the archives has blotted out original thought. And indeed, there's a caution for you. My second caution, think about Sir Walter Raleigh sitting there locked up in the Tower of London, writing his history of the world, and about to get his head cut off, actually, who warned us, beware of following history too close at the heels, for it may kick out your teeth. This is a risk I take every day of my dental work. But my third caution comes from Oliver Cromwell, who wrote to the Parliament, I beseech thee in the bowels of Christ to consider that you may be wrong. Now, I always had problem with that visual, the bowels of Christ. I really had a hard time with that. But you have to consider that I may well be wrong in everything that I'm about to say to you. And so keep that in mind. That attitude of skepticism is extremely useful for scholarship and international relations. And I may be wrong. So feel free, ask me some tough questions when we get to the end, and I'll try to run through some of my big points. My main ones are these four. One of them is to study the documents is to see vividly the interactive quality of international relations. You all know the security dilemma, how one side's defensive actions are perceived by the other as aggressive actions, and vice versa. And the documents really pile example after example after example, especially when it comes to nuclear weapons, but also I would say in the cybersecurity arena today, and I'll come back to that. So my second point would be the documents tell us, watch out for the official spin. There's almost always more to it, almost always more that actually contradicts the government line. And it's really worth seeing that dynamic. We can see it on the Afghanistan war that's just whimpering to an end now, right now, this summer, where for 20 years, according to the documents, the top commanders, the top generals knew they were not making progress, but kept telling the public and the Congress otherwise. Or look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. Over 30 years of excavating the US, the Soviet, the Cuban documents, we now know the old spin was wrong. The spin was we went eyeball to eyeball with the Ruskies, and they blinked. And that was the cover of Life magazine. That was the Kennedy spin. Now we know there was a backdoor deal. There was diplomacy. There was negotiation. That both sides blinked, thinking events were getting out of control, and walked back from the brink. But that spin, that you can ratchet up pressure on your opponent and ultimately they will back down, that led straight into the Vietnam War, and Hanoi didn't back down. Third, the documents tell us beware the black and white version of events, the extreme version of events. So for example, take the biggest espionage trial of the Cold War, the espionage trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, right? Accused of stealing the atomic secret, providing it to the Soviets, jump-starting the Soviet bomb program. Their accusers said spies. Their defenders said they're being framed by the government. 50 years later, in court, we get the grand jury records that show both those positions are correct. Julius was a spy running a spy ring. Ethel was framed and sent to the electric chair. Shouldn't have been. How do we know that? Because in the grand jury records, we can see Ethel's brother changed his testimony to save his wife and fry his sister. Julius was a spy, not an atomic spy. His big score was actually the proximity fuse. So that was a huge advantage to the Soviets during World War II to understand how that worked technically. So both sides of that black and white debate were correct, say the documents. It adds so much more nuance and context, and that's one of the great virtues. So you got the interactive quality, you got beware of spin, you got beware of the black and white version. And that brings me to my fourth point, which is the documents are not truth. I'm not saying they're not true, but they're not truth. They are evidence. Evidence that has to be weighed against other evidence. Evidence that has to be interrogated the way you interrogate a witness. You have to ask of the documents, who wrote them? Why did they write them? What were they trying to accomplish? Who was supposed to read them? Who actually did read them? Who saved them? Who classified them? Who declassified them? How did we get them today? How do they compare to other documents of that same time or subsequently? How do they compare with interviews? How do they compare with the public record? Evidence. That let me just give you an example from the front pages last month. So you probably read or saw the Pentagon finally released an internal study dragged to it by Congress of UFOs. The 170 plus encounters with unidentified flying objects captured either on video by Air Force and Navy pilots or by credible eyewitness testimony by people like pilots who are trained to make instant recognition of objects in the air for warfighting purposes, right? So all these reporters start calling the National Security Archive. Do you have any documents on UFOs? And I say, well, my board of directors said, don't do UFOs. There's too many people out there chasing documents on UFOs. Do the parts of this history that are not so well known, not so well documented. But we did have an item. We had an Air Force history from the 1990s looking back at a project called Project Mogul. There's a Soviet angle here, so wait for it. Project Mogul was a series of high altitude balloons clad in titanium and other metallic elements for survival at high altitudes that were drifted across the Pacific Ocean from places in Japan and South Korea to capture radioactive debris after Soviet nuclear tests that then American nuclear engineers could reverse engineer the Soviet bomb and figure out what are they using in it, how strong in it, all that stuff. And one of those balloons crashed out west in the desert in the 1950s. And this internal Air Force history from 40 years later said, gosh, our counterintelligence guys are pretty happy because the locals all think this was an alien spacecraft. And our counter intel is very happy about that. What a great cover story, right? We're not going to expose the fact of our high altitude balloons across the Soviet Union. So that was our one small contribution to the UFO story. My document, this history, it's not truth. It doesn't disprove possible visits by aliens to Earth's atmosphere, not at all. But it adds some context and it adds some nuance and it adds some evidence to the story that helps explain some of the ways that conspiracy theories develop, helped by the secrecy, helped by counterintelligence. So, and I have to say that kind of documentary evidence is one of the big holes in studying today's cybersecurity issues. And I say that particularly in the context of current US-Russia discussions on possible cyber rules of the road and the like, but we really only have one side of the story on cyber, which is a daily barrage. My front page of the Washington Post today is a follow-up story on the Colonial Pipeline hack. And every day in your screens, you'll read about another ransomware, another hack of ranging back to Sony and forward to, dams in Ukraine or wherever else. And so you get this barrage and you come away from it as a viewer, even as a policy analyst, with the sense of being a victim of we're on the receiving end of all these attacks. And whoever's doing this to us, they must be just demons, devils. And you get into that black and white attitude I was just warning about. But the fact is, and we know this just from a few documents, the United States has been doing offensive cyber operations for more than 20 years, back to the 90s. We only have documented one of those operations. It was called Glowing Symphony, and it was an extraordinarily successful takedown of ISIL's social media accounts that they were using to recruit folks to come to Syria and Iraq to fight for the Islamic State. And Cyber Command took them down, and a year and a half ago was so proud of what they'd accomplished that they actually responded to our Freedom of Information Act request and gave us the after action reports, declassified. But it's the only one of what must be hundreds of similar cyber operations out there today. We know a little bit about Stuxnet, for example, because some whistleblowers inside talked to David Sanger of the New York Times because of the way that malware targeting Iran and Iran's nukes actually came back to bite us in the rear in our own global networks. But we don't have documents on that. We just have some oral accounts by some inside whistleblowers. But the rest of our cyber offense is a blank slate. It's hidden behind the secrecy veils, and it produces a lot of paranoia and security dilemma thinking out there. we could do with a lot more transparency on those operations. And I think we're going to have to, if we're going to ever get to rules of the road on cyber that Russia would ever agree with, or China would ever agree with, or that the big corporations would agree with. Just look, there was this summary released by the Director of National Intelligence right before President Trump was sworn in. And it was summarizing the state of intelligence community knowledge about Russian interference in the 2016 elections in favor of Trump against Clinton. And buried in there, it wasn't in the key findings, it wasn't in the summary, but buried in there was a conclusion of the US intelligence community that President Putin had signed off on those operations because of his resentment of the release earlier in the year, April 2016, of the Panama Papers, exposing all these offshore transactions. And President Putin saw this release as an offensive US cyber operation targeting him and his friends who were engaged in some of those offshore accounts. I think he was wrong about that. I think President Putin doesn't appreciate or understand whistleblowers at all, including the person who worked for that Panama law firm who gave that database of offshore accounts to the journalists. But that's the kind of thinking that we're into if we can't both get back to rules of the road and overall reduce the threat. And I think that lesson comes through looking at the documents across the shared experiences of the United States and the Soviet Union, the United States and Russia. Let's just take a look. I mentioned briefly Afghanistan and the official spin. Look, there was a Soviet war on Afghanistan that the United States grossly misinterpreted in terms of motivation. It's a fascinating study because in the Soviet war in Afghanistan brought out the worst in both sides. It brought out the worst in the Soviet Union, bombing villages, killing civilians, brought out the worst in the United States, getting in bed with some really evil people like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and some of the extremists in Afghanistan and the intelligence service in Pakistan. So fast forward, after Gorbachev pulled out the troops in 1988-89, we started getting documents about that. You can look then at the US war. Interestingly, Russia was on our side from 2001. President Putin signed off on transits across Russia to help our buildup in Afghanistan, chasing Osama bin Laden, et cetera. So Russia being on our side in our war didn't produce any better outcome than in their war. There was both the Soviets and the Americans are very proud of what each had done for the status of women in Afghanistan during their period there. This is something, and there's a great story. We found one antecedent for it in some Soviet literature. I most recently heard it from an American contractor in Afghanistan. They run into an Afghan family trudging along a trail outside Kabul. And remarkably, the woman of the family, the mother, is not walking behind her husband as is the traditional stance, but she's out in front. And so they rush over to the husband to congratulate him on how, his modern ways and modernization and great steps for the status of women. And he nods modestly and thanks them and points ahead to his wife and says, landmines. Soviet era and American era. And I don't want to be too cynical about this because to me, the more interesting stories are the way we each saw each other's motivations. And so wrongly, when the Soviets invaded in December 1979, President Jimmy Carter saw it as part of a grand plan, master plan, Soviet aggression in the Middle East, the arc of crisis, the historic drive to a warm water port on the Indian Ocean. And when we started getting the documents out two decades later, we shared them with Anatoly Dobrynin, who was working on his memoirs and came to us to say, what do you have? Declassified documents. That's one of our constituencies, former officials who want to understand what they themselves went through and understand more about the other side. We showed him all these internal documents from Zbigniew Brzezinski and Carter about the grand plan, master plan of Soviet aggression. And Dobrynin, to his enormous credit, used those documents as leverage and got access into the Kremlin archives. This is 1993, 94, when things were wide open, really, under Yeltsin. Old systems were really broken down, old standards. And Dobrynin was a very senior guy. And so he got in and looked at the actual notes and minutes and took his own notes. What did Andropov say to Brezhnev? What was the Politburo's reading? What were their motivations? Turned out Andropov had overridden all the advice of their experts about that invasion. Reminds me of about, say, 2003 in Iraq. But Dobrynin brought those notes to a conference with us and put them side by side with the American analysis and showed that what had really turned the decision for Brezhnev was Andropov telling to him, we know from the KGB resident in Kabul that our guy in Kabul, Amin, our client, our commie client, he's about to go over to the Americans. He's going to pull a Sadat, what Sadat did in Egypt, throw us out. We're going to have NATO on our southern flank. This is what Andropov really thought. I mean, at the conference, we were saying, boy, what kind of paranoia is that? I mean, this shows the degradation of Soviet thinking. By the end of the 70s, Brezhnev's stagnation, all these guys were in their 70s and 80s. And yeah, that's not right. Well, what was it Satchel Paige said? Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean somebody's not following you. So 30 years later, through the Freedom of Information Act, we get a cable that had been secret up to that point. A short-term US diplomat visiting Kabul at the end of October on a short-term assignment actually got in to see Amin for almost an hour, all in English. Amin had studied at Columbia University in New York. The diplomat, short-term, and so this cable was sort of in the bowels of the State Department, which is a different place from the bowels of Christ for sure. But the cable said Amin is hedging against Soviet control. He wants to be friends with us. He's complaining about how overbearing the Soviets are. He wants to work out something, maybe resume some of the US aid that was cut off earlier. So this guy, this diplomat going in to see Amin was on the local news. Now, substance of the conversation, it was just the two of them talking English, no interpreters, no other staff. But now we know where Andropov got this idea. He wasn't so wrong. It's fascinating. And the Americans didn't see it, didn't see the interactive quality, didn't see the rising sense of threat. We published this in the New York Times just a year and a half ago, right after President Trump had defended the Soviet invasion. He said, oh no, they went into Afghanistan chasing terrorists. And our headline was, not Trump's terrorists, not Brzezinski's warm water ports. It just, neither one of those. It was the sense of threat and the interaction quality. And when the Americans went in 2001, actually chasing terrorists, Osama bin Laden, none of them thought they'd still be there 20 years later, dodging roadside bombs. And the documents are coming out. We won this lawsuit to get Donald Rumsfeld snowflakes. These are these quickie memos. He dropped blizzards of them on the Pentagon every day. They called them snowflakes for that reason. And some of them are just brilliant. One of them he writes to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and his intel liaison. It's a 2-page memo, but the key phrase is at the top of the second page. Are we killing the terrorists in the GWAT, Global War on Terror, faster than our violent reaction is helping the madrasas create more terrorists? Interesting question. Nobody could answer it. What were the metrics? What are the metrics in the global war on terror? He was at least asking the question. In 2003, as early as that, Rumsfeld wrote to his top intel guy, I just have no visibility into who the actual enemies are in Afghanistan. Another snowflake. We talk about how many schools we've built? Well, they wrote up how many schools they built. They couldn't write up how many schools were actually being used, how many still exist today. The clarity, you put that together with interviews done by the Army History Center and the Inspector General, and you see that 20 years worth of official statements about progress in Afghanistan, actually, when they're talking to each other, talking to themselves, they know it's not happening. It's not happening. Think about on this overall theme of interaction, I was fascinated to hear from Anna the idea of doing trilateral discussions, Chinese, Russian, American, and West Europeans. And I noticed that one of the lectures is about the so-called Kissinger's triangle of US, Soviet Union, China. And I just want to say the document suggests that Kissinger doesn't deserve any credit for that triangle. And it's a fascinating revision of history that you only know not from reading Kissinger's books, but from reading the declassified record of what he and the Chinese and the Soviets actually said to each other at the time. We won a lawsuit against the State Department just to get those transcripts. Kissinger had taken them with him when he left the State Department in 1977 and moved them to the Library of Congress. An earlier lawsuit, I think Justice Stevens commented, well, it does raise the implication that Dr. Kissinger put them in the Library of Congress because Congress made itself not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Yes. It took us years, but we got the State Department to recover those. And in the early 2000s, we took those MIMCONs to Beijing. A little bit more document interaction. We showed them to a very interested audience of Chinese scholars, former diplomats, academics, and they were fascinated to read. You can picture the scene, the famous Nixon-Mao meeting. There's Kissinger, his note taker, Winston Lord, in the official photograph. You can only see his wingtip shoe because Kissinger didn't want the Secretary of State to know that he'd taken a junior staff with him and left the Secretary of State, Bill Rogers, out of the meeting. In that meeting, Mao teases Kissinger and says, oh, and so Dr. Kissinger, when are you going to run for president of the United States? And Kissinger says, oh no, under the Constitution, I'm not qualified. I wasn't born in the United States. I can't run for president. But Chairman Mao, your translator could. She was born in Greenwich Village. She went to the Little Red Schoolhouse. She could run for president. Kind of put a stop to that line of conversation. But what we were fascinated by was when we produced our documents, the Chinese started showing us their documents. Turns out the foreign ministry did an academic training for their diplomats on the whole triangle relationship, except the title of their course was called Playing the American Card. Not playing the Chinese card, playing the American card. Turns out the documents the Chinese gave us dated back to early 1969 when Soviet and Chinese forces clashed on the borders. And 4 old marshals, friends of Mao's from the Long March, who'd been sent for their own safety to a little factory to get out of the way of the Red Guards. They wouldn't be thrown out of the windows. These 4 marshals looked at those clashes and said, you know what? We're having some real problems with the near barbarian, meaning the Soviets. It's time to reach out to the far barbarian, meaning the Americans. So they wrote a recommendation memo to the Chairman Mao saying, you got to reach out to the far barbarians to bring them in to play off against the near barbarians. And, it still took 2 years. Kissinger in his own memoir says the signals they sent were too subtle by far for us, us Americans. They had Edgar Snow on the Arch of the Revolution in Tiananmen Square with Chairman Mao, which is unprecedented appearance for an American, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, I won't go on into that, but the fascinating thing about this dynamic is, within 2 years, you have Nixon showing up in China, the far barbarian coming to pay tribute to the emperor, repeating elements of Chinese history going back, hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's a fascinating story for so many reasons. And I'll just give you one more, which is Kissinger firmly believed that triangle was going to force Hanoi into ending the Vietnam War, that pressure from Beijing and pressure from Moscow would bring Hanoi to its senses. And in fact, we know from the documents, Hanoi hated this whole idea. Hanoi totally resisted it. When Nixon went to China, Hanoi became even more obstinate in the Paris peace talks. It was like the hatred for China was in certain ways as great as the hatred for the Americans who were bombing them at that precise time. And the obtuseness of American diplomacy in thinking that this would work to our benefit is a fascinating dynamic of interaction. But a bunch of trucks are passing outside. Let's hope they don't drive in the driveway. But here we are at Monterey. So we got to talk about nukes. This is, Bill Potter built this amazing institution. And so I want to say a couple of positive things about China, right? China and nukes, which not something you're going to hear usually, but for ever since their first nuclear explosion in 1964, which the US kind of partly predicted, good intelligence and such, unlike the Soviet test of 49. China chose a nuclear posture that was probably the only rational nuclear posture among all the nuclear powers. It's called finite deterrence. They understood with 25, max 30 ICBMs, that was enough. They didn't need to build up the 70,000 fissile warheads that the US and the Soviet Union built up. They could protect themselves, they could deter. And it's a fascinating dynamic because that was what the head of the US Navy recommended to the US in 1958 and 59. Finite deterrence. He said just a handful of Polaris submarines on patrol would have enough nuclear megatonnage to destroy the Soviet Union. There's a great memo we posted on our wall from 1960. The head of the Bureau of the Budget, a guy named Maurice Stans under Eisenhower, he writes, I've just had my briefing on Polaris, and for only a couple $100 million, we could have these subs on patrol and have a very effective deterrent against the Soviet Union, which raises the question, why do we need all these ICBMs and all these far-flung bomber bases and all this other stuff that's going to cost billions? And when I raised that question, I was told that's somebody else's problem. So the budget guy goes back to the drawing board. And you look at what then happened with the arms race, US and Soviet mirror imaging. We got through, it took us 10 years, and we got the actual nuclear war plan declassified for 1959. So we're 10 years into the mutual US-Soviet nuclear era. And that nuclear war plan was an absolute eye-opener because it was constructed in absolute secrecy. No civilians allowed, by the way. Civilians didn't get into the war planning until the late 1980s, if you can believe that. But that's what the documents say. Total secrecy, just uniformed folks on the joint staff doing the targeting. And every time they got a piece of intelligence about a factory being built or an airfield being built anywhere in the Warsaw Pact, they would put another bomb in the war plan to target that target. So the 1959 war plan had 179 thermonuclear devices targeted on Moscow. 179. I mean, after about 3, you're blowing up your other bombs. You're bouncing the rubble. Even more insane around the Warsaw Pact, East Berlin had 91 nuclear bombs targeted on East Berlin. 91. Did anybody tell the Joint Staff we have thousands of US and Allied troops in a place called West Berlin? What's going to happen to them? Okay. This is the insanity, really, of the self-perpetuating, hermetically sealed nuclear arms race. Happened on the American side first, then it happened on the Soviet side because of mirror imaging, because of the sort of interactive drivers, 70,000 fissile warheads, ultimately incredible glut of fissile material all over the world, terrible for world security, for what we're facing today. And it's an extraordinary story driven by secrecy and interaction. Back to China, but this also bears on US-Russia. Right now, we're getting through a Freedom of Information lawsuit, a lot of Strobe Talbot's MIMCONs from the 1990s, who's Deputy Secretary of State. And a couple of my favorite ones, you have the Chinese complaining to Strobe about Americans' anti-ballistic missile defenses. Why are you spending billions on ABM? And Strobe says, no, you guys, you got it wrong. They're not targeting China. That's about North Korea. We just don't want North Korea to be able to launch something that can hit San Francisco. We got to be able to try to shoot it down with our interceptors. And the Chinese say to Strobe, it doesn't matter who they're targeting for. They diminish the credibility of our deterrence. Between that point and today, the Chinese have built up about tenfold their nuclear arsenal. They're now approaching 300 deliverable nuclear weapons. This summer in the Washington Post, the great columnist David Ignatius, usually reliable, wrote a whole column. Why the Chinese nuclear buildup? Why the buildup? It must be about pressuring Taiwan. Nowhere in the op-ed was there the words, missile defense. Russia sees it the same way. It doesn't matter if we're targeting Iranian missiles. If it diminishes the credibility of the Soviet deterrence, it's an incentive for buildup. And that's the great conundrum. Ronald Reagan kept trying to persuade Gorbachev, no, we're only doing ballistic missile defense, SDI. We'll share it with you. We want to abolish nuclear weapons, and this will be our insurance policy against a madman or an accident. Gorbachev never quite could afford to believe him. And ultimately, Gorbachev told Reagan in 1988, yeah, I understand you're really focused on this, but my scientists tell me all we have to do to overwhelm your missile defense is more missiles, more decoys, more warheads. And that's way cheaper than your huge investment in ABM. So it's a fascinating dynamic. So it raises this question, how many nukes do you actually need? You have China taking this finite deterrence. And you go back to the documents on the Cuban Missile Crisis and you see that John F. Kennedy was deterred from invading Cuba by the chance of one medium-range missile landing on Atlanta from Cuba, one. He called off the invasion after hearing that briefing from the head of the Tactical Air Command, an honest man named General Walter Sweeney, who deserves a lot of credit for basically saying to the president, said, can you get them all, meaning get all those missiles? And Sweeney said, we're going to run 2,000 sorties over Cuba. We're going to blow up a lot of stuff. But no, I can't promise you that I can get them all. We may not even really know where all of them are. And in fact, they didn't know there were about 100 tactical nukes in Cuba, including one on a cruise missile 15 kilometers from Guantanamo. If the United States had invaded, boom goes Gitmo. And where that would end, doctrine was you reply with a nuke. I don't want to, McNamara is the one who in our conferences in Cuba said, who knows where that would have ended. So we know how close we came and how out of control from the documents. And you think about, at the quarantine line, we're blockading Cuba. So the Soviets had sent some submarines, diesel submarines. We didn't know, but on each submarine was a nuclear torpedo, and the sub-commanders could launch it if we scored a hole in their hull or they were sinking. One of those nuclear torpedoes would take out not just an aircraft carrier, but an aircraft carrier and much of its accompanying fleet, right? So our anti-submarine guys are following these subs, tracking them all the way from the North Sea, all the way down to the Sargasso Sea. And they're using these little, totally approved by Washington, even a discussion on the Kennedy tapes. It's called little signaling grenades. These little grenades that you drop over the water in a certain pattern, Morse code pattern that says, come to the surface, we know where you are. Well, on the Navy ships, these guys are getting pretty frustrated. These little pop firecrackers, they called them. We can do better than that. That they then would take the grenade pin, but put it into a cardboard tube, actually a toilet paper tube. Imagine those little tubes in the middle of a toilet paper roll. Put the little grenade inside the tube, drop it overboard. It would take a couple minutes for that cardboard to start to disintegrate and the pin to pop up. And meanwhile, the grenade is going down, 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 closer and closer to the sub. Boom. In the diary of a Soviet lieutenant on one of those subs, he writes about the feeling of being inside an oil drum where somebody is hitting it with a sledgehammer on the outside. And these guys have a nuclear torpedo. That's how close and how reckless and that we came. I mean, and how do we know this stuff? Because documents leverage documents. Let me paint you a scene. We're in the conference room of the Palace of the Revolution in Havana. Across the table is Fidel Castro. I'm on this side with McNamara and Schlesinger. Down at that end is Gribkov, who planned the deployment. Leonov, the KGB guy, Sergo Mikhayan, son of Anastas Mikhayan. And having this pretty amazing multiple discussion based on documents. Our lawyer, who'd won a lawsuit, breaking loose thousands of pages, makes a presentation to Fidel, literally 20,000 pages, declassified US documents, transcripts of the tapes, and best of all, brand new, just from the release, the Kennedy-Khrushchev letters, where the US and Soviet leaders bargain Fidel's fate without him in the loop. Fidel was fascinated by this. He gets a sense, he snaps his fingers And from the corner of the room comes one of his bodyguards carrying a banker's box, drops it in front of Fidel. Fidel starts flipping through the files. Oh, look at this. This is the letter Comrade Nikita wrote me afterwards, apologizing for pulling out his missiles and announcing it on the radio and telling me, please come visit me in the Soviet Union. You're young and passionate now and mad at me and all that, but we can make up. Come on, I'll still help you out. More or less a blank check for Cuba. It was a fact. Historians didn't know about this letter. Castro drops it on the table and makes a joke, kind of a feeble joke. He says, yes, this declassification stuff, it must have something to do with the class struggle. Everybody laughs. He's a dictator after all, and you keep him happy. That's the way you survive. So it was a fun moment in the conference. But fast forward to the next time we were to Armageddon, 1983. And who knew? Because it was in total secret at the time. The war scare of 1983, a NATO nuclear command exercise called Able Archer. We're proceeding November of 83, ratcheting up our various, there's about 50,000 extra troops in Europe for the exercise. We got people playing different roles. The whole European command is involved. And all of a sudden, this Air Force guy, I think he was just a brigadier, maybe a major general at the time, named Leonard Perutz, he starts getting these intercepts. The Soviets are going on high alert. Another intercept. They just moved nuclear bombs out to the planes on the runway. This is talking November 1983, right? Whoa, they've just moved the planes over to the edge of the runway, ready for takeoff. Oh, out of Moscow, the head of the Soviet Air Forces has raised the alert status of the whole Soviet Air Force. These are all intercepts. How can I quote them to you? They're above top secret, Umbra, Gamma, no foreign, right? That's the codes on them, because they were just declassified in January of this year, finally, showing that the Air Force guy got it right. An internal top secret study by the President's Foreign Intelligence Board credited Perutz with saving the world. Because what Perutz did watching Soviet escalation was to stand down. He did not escalate. The board said he wasn't trained to do that. He didn't know better. He didn't have any instructions about what to do, but his instincts told him they're going on high alert for why? Let's not do anything to spook them. Let's not escalate. He stood down. That board report wouldn't exist except Perutz on his retirement wrote a nasty letter saying the CIA has gotten this wrong for decades. Please look into this. The Soviets went on high alert. There's no evidence of this high alert in the Politburo documents, by the way, because Andropov was in the hospital on a dialysis machine. The Politburo never even talked about the NATO exercise. But this was happening at the military level, at the mill-to-mill level, like the submarines at the quarantine line in the Cuba crisis, military level. There were so many nukes around, things could so easily escalate and get out of control. And one guy decided to de-escalate. And that's kind of one of my big points about interaction. The biggest progress in international relations has come from de-escalation, not escalation. Just look at Biden and Putin meeting last month in Geneva. Made this, people wondered if what they were going to do that was productive or constructive. And what they did was produce a statement that was the same statement that Ronald Reagan made with Mikhail Gorbachev at Geneva in 1985, which is nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought. And this was a big advance given the level of tensions. But look back in 1985. Why would Reagan go for that? Because after Reagan was briefed on this whole Able Archer business and some leaks not leaks, but some espionage from Gordievsky in the London embassy, the London KGB resident, Reagan writes in his diary in December 83, oh my God, the Soviets actually think we might want to attack them. I would never do such a thing. It just makes it more important for me to get in the same room with them so I can assure them we won't do it. 1985, Geneva. Gorbachev finds out Reagan is a nuclear abolitionist. He wants to share Star Wars because it's an insurance policy when we get rid of all nukes in the world. Chernayev, Gorbachev's top aide, writes in his diary, Gorbachev is finally realizing that Reagan won't push the button. And why do we need all of our nukes? And why do we need all our repressive apparatus if the Americans are not going to strike? De-escalation led to the abolition of an entire class of nuclear weapons, intermediate nuclear range, INF in 87, led to Gorbachev really making amazing proposals. And this is an interesting lesson for today on interaction, because Gorbachev said to George H.W. Bush after Reagan, why don't we get rid of all the tactical nuclear weapons? You know, that's the place where you could so quickly escalate into nukes. That's the most dangerous. And we both have a lot of tacticals. You got them on all your Navy ships. And look, you're going to have protests in New Zealand and protests in Japan when those ships come in, because they know that you've got nukes on there. And that's just, that it's a hair trigger. And it moves us into the nuclear sphere too quickly. We need to have more time. We need to back off from that. So Gorbachev proposed that, but not until after the coup attempt of 91, the hardliners almost get rid of Gorbachev. It really led to the rise of Yeltsin. Bush realizes Gorby's not there for very long. And so Bush takes the unilateral initiative, the President's Nuclear Initiative, September 91. It's a fascinating case study for what we could think about in cyber or in nuclear weapons today. Bush says, work up a plan, take all of our tacticals off the Navy ships. The admirals think about that, and they'd resisted it for years. Oh, that's actually a great idea, because if we ever get to a tactical exchange with the Soviet Navy, we lose. They lose too, but we lose more. If we're just in a conventional exchange, we'll whack them. We'll beat them terribly. We should not get into nukes. So they agreed. Gorbachev takes the phone call from Bush. We've published the transcript. This is great, George. I talked about this at Malta 2 years ago. This is terrific. Let's do it. Let me go order my guys. And it turns out there were some heroes on the Soviet side, later Russian side. People like Yevgeny Maslin, general, head of the 12th GUMO, the warhead control division of the general staff. Maslin looks at the warheads scattered all over the Soviet Union and says, oh my God, things are kind of falling apart. You got the Ukrainians talking independence. You got the Baltics on their way out. You got the Kazakhs that even had closed Semipalatinsk in August, right at the time of the coup. We're losing control here. And so Maslin sets about regaining control of all those warheads with the help of Bush's unilateral initiative and Gorbachev's agreement. And thank God. Fast forward December 1991, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney goes on Meet the Press, I think. And they say, Secretary Cheney, so aren't we at real risk of the Soviet nukes, loose nukes getting out of control? There, it's really, that could be really. What's your assessment? And Cheney says, oh, my assessment's not too bad. They've got about 25,000 nuclear warheads around the Soviet Union, and we estimate that they'll safely control probably 99% of those. Okay, the host didn't ask him the next question. So what happens to the 250 nuclear warheads they don't control? Nobody asked. The reason none of those 250 got in the hands of terrorists or other actors is because of an amazing bipartisan program that Bill Potter's tenured professorship is named after, the Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar professor he is, because Nunn and Lugar, Dem and Republican, saw the threat, saw the quickly declining central control over nukes, passed bipartisan legislation, reprogrammed Defense Department money to invest in the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation in controlling the warheads, demobilizing the missiles, destroying the silos, cleaning up the nuclear waste, centralizing all this in the control of Moscow. And that's one of the great myths about US-Soviet relations, is that so many Russians today really believe the United States was delighted when the Soviet Union broke up and tried its hardest to break up the Soviet Union. And in fact, you read the documents, and the United States and the Bush administration was working as hard as it could to keep the Soviet Union together because of this enormous fear of the loss of central control over nuclear weapons, which could mean the end of the world, or at least the destruction of New York City. which is worse, I don't know. The core American goal, and just think about the famous Chicken Kiev speech. Bush goes to Ukraine and says, you guys, we appreciate that, you want some independence, but beware of this kind of suicidal nationalism, right? So imagine the Ukraine crisis today if nukes were in Ukraine. Some Ukrainians would say, well, if we had nukes, we wouldn't have this crisis today. The Russians wouldn't mess with us. I think otherwise, it actually creates a far more dangerous and destabilizing dynamic. And so I would just go, I want to sort of leave you a little time for questions. And so I'm just going to try to end with that really underappreciated success of the whole Nunn-Lugar program at rounding up the nukes and cleaning up the mess. Svetlana and I were in Kazakhstan in 2015, 2016. They took us up to Semipalatinsk, the site of all these hundreds and hundreds of Soviet for overground and then underground tests. You can't land at the place where the overground tests were for more than about 20 minutes without getting an unacceptable dose of radiation. But you can land on top of the mountain, Degolin Mountain, underneath which were all the shafts where they planted the bombs. Well, it turned out after the end of the Soviet Union, there was a bunch of plutonium down there left over from these different experiments. And what a cleanup job, because given the economic state in Kazakhstan in the 1990s, like so much of the former Soviet Union, thieves were coming on to Semipalatinsk to rip up the copper wiring to sell the copper on international markets. Radioactive copper cables were showing up in markets in the Koreas. So the cleanup was huge, but how to actually get that done? Well, the United States provided the money, and Kazakhs provided some indigenous expertise from the Kurchatov Institute and the will, the national will. And believe it or not, American scientists got Russian scientists at some of those labs like Arzamas and elsewhere, Chelyabinsk, to come to Kazakhstan and help point out where the shafts were. Exactly how much plutonium, the total state secret. The actual makeup of the bomb being tested, total state secret. But by coming, they could participate in the actual sealing of the tunnels, recovery of plutonium, and making that place, if not habitable, it's not habitable. The Kurchatov Institute, which had been the bait where Sakharov actually designed the Soviet H-bomb, right, is now an environmental monitoring station trying to track what will be 10,000 years of radiation at that place. But you have a sense from the Nunn-Lugar program of the kind of optimism even. And you have the Kazakhs who now become a part, certainly under Obama, and they hope to do so again, of a global nuclear security regime where people ban nuclear weapons, ban nuclear testing, and begin a real process of denuclearization like we managed in the former Soviet Union. So, and I guess that's my final lesson from all the documents. And it's really a quote from the former Los Alamos lab director, Siegfried Hecker, who was so much a part of these cleanups at Degolin Mountain and elsewhere in Kazakhstan, and who personally flew into some of the airstrips in those former secret cities in Russia, meeting some of those scientists for the first time, shaking hands on the runway. He assembled a terrific set of essays and memories of this whole project over 20 years in a 2-volume collection that's really worth a look if you haven't seen it. And his title is my final point about US-Russia relations. His title is Doomed to Cooperate. Doomed to Cooperate. Nukes make us doomed to cooperate. Cyber makes us doomed to cooperate. Geopolitics makes us doomed to cooperate. So let's get on with it. Thank you for your kind attention. And please, I'd love to have questions.
Wonderful.